How comfortable and pleasant can you really be for 2 full days in the dead of winter out in the forest in deep freeze temperatures? Well, hang on, because we're just about to find out. We loaded up the trailer with everything we could possibly imagine needing, and that's a lot of stuff. It was already close to 5 in the afternoon, so the sun had long since set when we headed out of town. At first we took the highway heading southwest, but eventually we turned off into smaller country roads. We passed a couple of small towns and villages out in the countryside before we pushed deeper and deeper into the forest. The road grew narrower with every turn we took, but to our surprise it had been plowed all the way until it ended in a turning area in the middle of nowhere, deep in the old-growth forest. The thick, freshly fallen snow was full of tracks from wildlife moving through the terrain. And the first thing we noticed were the tracks of a large wild boar. We didn't have to search long before we found a flat enough clearing, big enough, near the road where we could pitch the tent. There were clear tracks from a cow moose and her calf that had passed by very recently. But we didn't have time to amuse ourselves by tracking animals in the snow. We had a camp to set up and half a ton of gear to carry from the car. Even with headlamps, it was a bit trickier to put up the tent in the dark, and the severe cold and snow made everything take longer. You have to keep your gloves on at all times, for example, except for brief moments when you need to tie a knot or fiddle with something that requires a bit of extra dexterity. And you can't touch anything other than perhaps fabric or dry wood with your bare hands. If you touch metal, your hands will burn freeze in seconds. The agreement was that we'd open the first beer once we had the cast iron stove lit inside the tent and the fire pit going outside. Even though it was already 7:45 by then, we allowed ourselves to sit down, relax and enjoy our drink for a good long while. We had pimped the pop-up tent with a string of LED lights that gave a soft, pleasant background glow. And we brought along a solid, sturdy kitchen bench so we could cook at a comfortable working height with a proper workspace. We didn't start preparing dinner until around 8:30, and we were in no hurry whatsoever. We chatted and enjoyed the stillness while we pottered about in the camp. It is incredibly quiet in the forest when the snow on the trees muffles every sound. Most people have probably never had the privilege of experiencing total silence, or a night sky completely free from light pollution from nearby towns or settlements. And that's such a shame, because it's truly an amazing experience everyone should have at least once.
Nu är det svinnice där inne. Ja.
Apparently it was a bit windy that evening, but we were so deep in the forest that we could barely hear a whisper of it. Freddan was in charge of dinner. No slow cooking this time, thankfully. It was thick cuts of beef alternating between frying and resting, later to be sliced before serving. When the food was nearly ready, John and I went into the tent to make it cozy and comfortable and organized. We unfolded the camp beds, organized all the gear and set the table with both a linen cloth and a candelabra. We placed the beds along the walls and stowed all the gear underneath them, so everything looked neat and tidy. The Parmesan cream had developed a frozen crust on the top because it was so cold outside. It was about -14 degrees Celsius and dropping that evening, so we made sure the stove kept burning constantly, spreading a comfortable warmth inside the tent. And finally it was time to eat. We all gathered around the table, hungry like starving wolves. Freddan served a rustic fried entrecote with parmesan cream and grilled bruschetta with tomato salsa and chopped parsley and garlic. The warmth in the tent made the camera totally fog over after we used it in the cold outside. But after some wiping, I managed to get it clean enough to document the food. That's a new thing, photographing your food for social media before eating. What a great idea! As usual, the wine was a couple of degrees too cold. Way too cold actually, despite the fact that this time we had tried to keep it at a reasonable temperature. We solved that by simply placing the bottle directly on the stove for a couple of minutes, as we always end up doing. And once it was poured into the glasses, it soon reached the right temperature.
Gammalt? Har du köpt, bjuder du på gammalt vin?
The wine was a Coturon, from Ron of all places, can you imagine? And old too. Who serves old wine? We enjoyed it thoroughly, and as always it was a fantastic meal. The mood was high and there was plenty of laughter and joking throughout the dinner. When it was time for digestives and cigars, way past midnight, we decided to move the armchairs out onto the road in the hope of catching a glimpse of the Northern Lights, and maybe even getting a photo of it. Unfortunately, there were no Northern Lights that night, not that we could see anyway. But despite the roughly minus 17 degrees Celsius, the mood was excellent and we had a great time. Well, you can probably see where this is heading, so I think I'll leave it there. We slept all the way until at least around 11 the next morning. And since I was planning to serve the Swedish Army's famous yellow pea soup with pork and pancakes for lunch, even though it wasn't a Thursday, I had to get started right away. It needs to simmer for several hours to turn out really good. I skinned and deboned a cured pork hock that was going to boil with the soup for a while, bones and all. It was a very cold, yet an absolutely wonderful day out in the forest, and we had no schedule to keep, so we let the day unfold entirely at our own pace. We puttered around, tidied up and took care of last night's dishes and so on. We thought we spotted fresh moose tracks right outside the tent. Tracks we couldn't remember seeing the night before. But to be fair, it had been very dark when we arrived, so we weren't completely sure.
Jag har frusit fast. Och strimmor.
Ja, jävligt coolt faktiskt.
Ja, fan.
After about half an hour, I took the bones and the large chunks of meat out of the soup, so I could dice the meat into smaller pieces.
Eller hur? Man vill ha ganska små fläskbitar, va?
Ja, det är väl så det brukar vara.
Ja. Tärna upp liksom.
Ja.
The bones we tossed out into the forest for the birds to pick at, while the diced meat went back into the soup.
Löken ska tydligen vara så att den liksom ska försvinna. Man tar i en hel lök med 2 stycken kryddnejlikor instuckna i.
Aha.
När ska man ta upp löken?
Nej, det
Man
gör
ska
man
inte
inte.
ta upp löken, den försvinner.
Den ska mosas liksom. Det betyder ju dock att den här ska koka jävla tag.
2,5 timmar.
Okej.
We realized we actually hadn't eaten any breakfast yet, so John boiled coffee on the jet stove. Then we moved the soup pot over to it, making room for the griddle on the fire pit, so we could fry tomatoes, sausage, black pudding and bacon for breakfast. Or perhaps we should call it brunch, since it was already somewhere between 1 and 2 in the afternoon by then. It didn't matter. None of us was paying much attention to the time anyway.
Toast. En vinnares frukost. Klockan 2:30. Ja, på dagen.
We took it easy and enjoyed our coffee in peace before straightening up a bit inside the tent, making sure the evening's wine was already placed on the table near the stove so it wouldn't get too cold. Again. The tent is large and spacious, roughly 5 meters in diameter, so there's plenty of room for 3 camp beds along the walls and a table for 4 between the center pole and the innermost bed. On either side of the door we usually place the wooden crates we use to transport the stoves and chimney pipes, and they work well as sturdy surfaces for water containers, heavy things or anything else that needs to stand securely out of the way. In the afternoon we were expecting a lunch guest. It was Joppis who wanted to come by and see how we were doing out in the forest. Believe it or not, he'd been out playing disc golf all morning, in this cold. But he didn't want to miss the chance to have pea soup and pancakes out in the forest. For anyone who's done military service in Sweden, that's nostalgia of the highest order. Since we had completely lost track of time, lunch was delayed quite a bit by normal standards, but Joppis didn't mind waiting. We sat down to catch up, shoot the breeze and enjoy life, while the soup kept simmering over the fire.
Ja, vi kunde ju inte ha våran varmvattenberedare för att den hade ju frusit i pumpen. Sen fick vi inte på den i alla fall.
I had prepared the pancake batter in advance, but I hadn't been nearly as careful about making sure I had the right equipment. I had a camping frying pan that was the same size as a classic Swedish pancake pan and with equally low sides, so I assumed it would work fine. But that turned out to be a miscalculation. As they say, assumption is the mother of all F-ups. It turned out to have a foldable handle, and on top of that I couldn't find a proper spatula flexible enough for pancake duty. Well, I had to experiment with the gear we had, and eventually I managed to produce a batch of pancakes that were somewhat acceptable. But they were maybe the worst pancakes I've ever made. And as a loyal subject of the Swedish king, I am deeply ashamed. Anyway, around 4 in the afternoon, with the sun already on its way down, lunch was finally served. We chose to eat inside the tent for practical reasons. So of course, the camera fogged up again, as you can see. The classic way to eat pea soup and pancakes is to drink warm Swedish punch with it. We had brought a special little copper kettle for that purpose. It sits on a small stand with a tea light underneath to keep the drink warm, and it has a tiny hole in the lid for the handle of the little ladle, so it can stay in place even with the lid on. As I said, they weren't my best looking pancakes, but they tasted all right.
Hoppas att det duger.
As you can see, there's plenty of room for 4 people at the dining table despite the camp beds. But it does require a somewhat clever bit of organizing inside the tent, especially in the winter when you have so much more stuff. It turns into chaos very quickly if you don't think things through. Since the tent has such a high ceiling with full standing height everywhere except right along the walls, it feels spacious, airy and comfortable even with a table in the middle. After lunch, Joppis thanked us, said his goodbyes and headed home. By then the sun had already set and it was pitch black outside when Freddan immediately began preparing dinner for the evening. On the menu for the evening was wild boar ragu that ideally should simmer for 5 or 6 hours for all the flavors to really come into their own.
Ja, ytterst marginellt möjliga. Men jag tror det handlade om att den svalnade så snabbt.
The wild boar came from the local hunting team and had actually been taken within a few hundred meters or possibly a kilometer or so from our current campsite. You can't get more locally sourced meat than that.
Vi är uppe och så springer de. Har de missat att vi gick upp?
Ja, än så har de typ varit utomhus säkert för att kissa, men att det inte registrerat än.
Nej. Ja, precis. Och de hinner gå in igen innan...
The meat had already been ground, which Joppis would probably have considered borderline semi-processed if he'd still been there. If you've seen our previous video from our November camping trip, you'll understand why. And by the way, I can highly recommend it if you enjoy this kind of videos. All our videos, in fact, because, well, this is what we do. We head out into the forest, make ourselves as comfortable as we possibly can, and cook the best food we were capable of during these circumstances. Simply enjoying life. This isn't about survival. It's about truly living. While the wild boar ragu simmered away in the pan outside, we took the opportunity to sit down inside and enjoy a glass of wine in the warmth. And believe it or not, for the first time ever, regardless of season, we opened a perfectly tempered bottle of wine while camping. You can imagine the steep learning curve that implies. Throughout the day, the temperature had been dropping, from very cold to very cold. So a large part of our work during these days was constantly chopping firewood into pieces small enough to fit either the jet stove or the cast iron tent stove. We had brought 10 sacks of prime birch firewood, 40 liters each, so in total we went through 400 liters of firewood during these days. We also managed to capture the exact moment on camera when the water reached freezing point in the pot and crystallized. This is what that looks like. And since it was so cold, we figured we might as well take advantage of it. So Freddan had planned for us to make ice cream for dessert later that evening. He scraped out a fresh vanilla pod with a knife and mixed it with generous amounts of powdered sugar in a metal bowl. Not that I think it was necessary in this temperature, but to help transfer the cold from the snow to the cream, he salted the snow before sinking the bowl into it. Then it was just a matter of pouring in the cream and stirring with a rubber spatula until it thickened, while the pasta water was coming to a boil on the jet stove. This particular bowl happened to have a rubber coating on the bottom on the outside, an anti-slip grip for kitchen counters, so actually no temperature transferred through the bottom at all, as it turned out. But it was so cold that it only took a couple of minutes anyway. Along the edges, where there were no rubber coating, the cream froze almost instantly. And before we knew it, it had turned into vanilla ice cream. We just set it aside to wait for the dinner to be ready. While waiting for the pasta, we each had a gallop beer. Well, that's a small beer served in a wine glass, meant to be drunk quickly before you gallop on to the next establishment.
Kalle, det var kall öl.
Det var kall öl.
Det var kall.
Ja, en liten kall.
Ja, det var lite kall.
A cold beer takes on a whole new meaning when it's minus 22 degrees Celsius and the beverage freezes in the glass as you drink it. It felt wonderful to go inside and sit down in the tent, when the linguine had finally cooked to a perfect tenderness, with just the slightest bite in the center. We mixed a small portion of the ragu directly into the pasta and stirred it in the pot to glaze the linguine before serving, and then everyone could add more ragu on their plates and top it with parmesan to taste. According to the timestamp on the video files, it was already 22:55 when we sat down to eat. And believe me, it was worth every minute of the 5 hours it took to make the meal. It was absolutely fantastic. We enjoyed the well-chosen wine to the fullest, and it was perfectly tempered, by the way. But John wanted a bit more Swedish punch, since the double-digit Sub-Zero Gallop beer had left him a little chilled on the inside. That led us to speculate about what the drink is called in English. You already know it since we mentioned it before in this video, but we didn't at the time. So for the first time on this trip, Freddan actually pulled out his phone so we could Google it.
Ibland ser Arac punch eller caloric punch. Men den allra vanligaste engelskspråkiga sammanhanget heter Swedish punch.
Now we all know. Once our thirst for knowledge was satisfied, it was time for dessert. Our homemade, or rather forest-made, vanilla ice cream. By the time we finished dessert, it was way after midnight and we felt it was time to crawl into bed after a long day. The fire went out twice during the night, but I had positioned myself so I could refill the stove without having to crawl out of my sleeping bag. That was probably a good thing because it was very cold, even inside the tent. When we woke up in the late morning, it was -7 degrees on the floor closest to the tent walls. That meant that every liquid that didn't contain alcohol had frozen, so the water containers were partially frozen even though we had placed them on top of the wooden crate to lift them off the ground. Even the coffee pot had frozen, despite being a thermos, so we had to thaw it on top of the stove. But finally, just after 11 in the morning or so, we got our long-awaited morning coffee.
Vad gott.
It was still biting cold, around minus 22 degrees Celsius, but a fantastic day to be out. To our great surprise, we discovered that a wild boar had rooted up the ground and dug several large holes in the frozen earth right behind our tent, next to the path to the latrine. And none of us had heard a sound. We must have been sleeping deeply. And judging by the tracks, it must have been a big boar. And the fact that it had managed to break through the frozen ground with its snout, the same frozen ground we had struggled to drive tent pegs into, only confirmed it. Speaking of the latrine, it exceeded all expectations. Without going into detail, but as you can imagine, it saw plenty of use, since this weekend was essentially dedicated to food and drink around the clock. It's ergonomic and stable, and thanks to the non-conductive seat, it was perfectly comfortable to sit on, even at minus 22 degrees Celsius. It didn't even feel cold against the skin. And it folds completely flat, just like an IKEA package, and weighs almost nothing. And with this view, it was honestly a pure delight to visit. If you want to know more about how I built it or how we solved other practical matters, let us know in the comments below. Ask away. Breaking camp is usually exhausting and draining energy, but this time we didn't make one concentrated effort to pack everything up. Instead, we took it bit by bit. One thing here, another thing there. We didn't look at the clock at all. We just did things in whatever order at whatever time felt right. Freddan and I packed up the sleeping gear and folded the camp beds, while John cooked the food. We noticed that we couldn't run the stove as hot as before without a little smoke seeping into the tent. So we assumed the spark arrestor on the chimney had become clogged after nearly 2 days of constant burning. And from the outside, it did look very black and sooty. All weekend we've been joking about the guy we'd seen on YouTube who claims you should always remove all the birch bark before burning birch firewood, because allegedly it produces greasy black soot that will really stick in the chimney and clog things up. We thought it sounded a bit exaggerated, figured it couldn't possibly make that much of a difference and hardly worth the effort. But this suggests he might actually be right. Brunch consisted once again of fried tomatoes, sausage, bacon, black pudding, fried bread and scrambled eggs. Since most of the drinking water had frozen solid, those of us who weren't driving had to drink beer for breakfast. What a shame! Strengthened by a hearty meal, we slowly began packing up camp and carrying things to the car. We wanted to enjoy this last day in the forest as well, so we kept a relaxed pace without stress or clocks. That part I think we really nailed on this trip. We shut off and disconnected from everything related to time. We let our bodies decide the pace and the priorities. That's a lesson we'll take with us and happily pass on to you as a viewer. Let departure day take the time it takes, at the comfortable pace. Experience the day and absolutely do not have a deadline waiting back in civilization. That can ruin the whole experience and the lasting memory of an otherwise fantastic trip. Since we had burned through all the firewood, packing up the trailer for the trip home was much easier. On the other hand, we had a bit of trouble getting into the car because the doors had frozen shut. Completely. Freddan had to start the heater remotely to thaw the car enough for us to open the doors. As you can see, our theory about the spark arrestor was correct. It was completely clogged. chimney cleaning is definitely another lesson for the future, and peeling off the bark from birch firewood before burning it.
Now there's your problem.
The very last thing we packed was the tent, and we did that only after everything else was already loaded into the car and trailer. We made sure to brush off all snow and debris so we wouldn't trap moisture that could damage the tent through mold or rot during storage until next camping trip. Finally, as the sun began to set around 4 in the afternoon, everything was packed and ready. The only thing we left behind were the tracks in the snow. Nothing, absolutely nothing else, remained to show that we had ever been there.